right, we will kick things off. Thank you for joining today. Today, we're going to be talking about why LinkedIn stops working for CEOs after Series A. We're going to be going fairly quickly today, but if you're new to the Zoom webinar format, anytime you have a question, you can drop it in the Q&A panel, and I'll stop periodically to take those questions. In terms of what we're going to cover today, I want to cover a few different areas. The first thing that we'll talk about is what I think of as this gear shift that many CEOs I've seen face of transitioning their role as leader of the organization. The bulk of our time is going to be spent in the second area where we talk about four specific shifts I've seen in clients that I've worked with for at least a year of seeing how they successfully made a transition, what I learned from them, and what I think we can abstract out to other leaders as well. And then we'll talk a little bit about authenticity. I want to make sure that everyone realizes that there are many different ways to do this, but authenticity is really the foundational element that brings us all together. And then we'll have time at the end for more Q&A, but feel free to put your questions in as we go along. Before we go further, I will send out a survey at the very end of this. This is the first webinar we're doing at Executive Presence in quite a while. I intend to do many more this year. And so if you can directly and honestly answer that, would love to understand how we did today, how we can improve, and then what other topics we could dive into in the future that you would value. And we'll be using that third question to slate out the subsequent webinars, and we'll be using the feedback to ensure that we're delivering as much value as possible in the time that we have. For those of you who don't know me, just quick background. My name is Justin Nassiri. I'm the CEO and founder of Executive Presence, which I've run for 3 years and 11 months now. I actually started my career in the Navy on board submarines, got out and got my MBA at Stanford Business School, and then over the last 15 years have run and sold 2 different companies, Executive Presence being the third. And in my role at Executive Presence, I've worked with about 200 senior leaders. 5 of them run publicly traded companies. Many of them are private equity backed, Series A, seed, self-funded startups, the full gamut. But I'm really pulling that knowledge from the work that I've done today. So before we get into these characteristics, I want to share a quick story. And that is, I started my career on board nuclear submarines, and I learned something that I see playing out with the clients I work with as well. So when I was on board my submarine, the leadership structure was fairly simple. We had a crew of about 150 people, but of that, there was about 10 junior officers, which is what I was, the junior officer. Above us, there were about 3 department heads who then reported into 1 executive officer and then the head honcho, the captain at the top. And I observed something in the 5 years I was on submarines. I worked with 12 different department heads, and I started to see a trend. I saw that these department heads, that's 1 level above me, there were many of these department heads where I could really see, man, they must have been great junior officers. They were able to get a lot of stuff done. They were able to really hustle and work. They were able to accomplish a lot. But what I observed is that many of those department heads, at least when I worked with them, they weren't able to shift gears into being a successful department head. I saw them continue to try to be that individual contributor. I saw them continue to try to do the work themselves. Rather than doing the gear shift of now leading a group of people and empowering them and amplifying their message and getting everyone in alignment. And it really stuck with me. And I always thought, man, would I be the junior officer who could do that gear shift successfully, who could say that what got me here is not going to be what I need for this next step, but I have to fundamentally change the way that I lead and operate to be successful in this new realm. And beyond life underwater, I've seen that play out with my clients as well. And I don't have any hard and fast data here, but for me, there's a nebulous transition that tends to occur. I always associate it with headcount. It's something around 20 to 50 employees. In that area, I see some leaders take that step forward, and some that, at least in my interactions with them, they seem to be stuck in the previous layer as CEO. And I'll go through these one by one. First and foremost, in this first type of CEO, they are really myopically fixated on sales. Everything tracks back to pipeline and to sales attribution. And I totally understand that as a sub 20 employee company myself. I understand the reason to be fixated on sales and the reason to be fixated on revenue. However, I've noticed in contrast, the CEOs that make it past that, I don't want to say graveyard, that's too strong, but make it past that transition period, it becomes less about sales and more about growth. And we'll talk about this in quite a bit of detail, but specifically, I see that about hiring and retaining talent, fundraising, broadcasting brand perception messages to both internal and external stakeholders. It becomes much more of shaping a brand narrative than just driving sales. So that's the first distinction that I see. The second one I've kind of classified as doing. And the way that I perceive it, and again, I embody this often in my own company, in this first era of a organization's development, the CEO is very often doing. And I think the mindset that I see is not just doing, but the belief that if I do great work in isolation, I will be discovered. If I have the best product, if I have the best team, if I have the best technology, that will be enough to differentiate and attract good things, usually sales, but other things as well. I think that the distinction that I see in those growth stage CEOs is that they realize that perception plays a much bigger role than any of us would like to admit. That the perception of who is growing, the perception of who has the best team or product or service, that really plays a big role in who ultimately gets the best term sheet, the best acquisition, the best hires. And so that's the second area that I see. Rather than heads down, let me do the work myself, let me let the work speak for myself. At this next stage, they realize I'm not going to leave it to chance. I'm not going to assume that the best company or culture or product or service will win. I realize I actually have to shape that narrative, and that will play a critical role in our success or failure. And then the other ones you're probably more familiar with, and there's probably people who can speak to this better than me, but there is that hands-on problem solving in the first stage that then becomes more sending signals, leading through others, delegation, things like that. And under 20 employees, you can definitely get away with, hey, I am showing up. I'm interacting with my team. They're meeting with me weekly. They're seeing me. They know me. So they know the origin story. They know our values. They know why we're doing this. And once you hit that level, again, around 50 employees, it is completely different. It's much more about persistence and consistency and multiple channels of distributing the same message. And we'll double click on that one in a second with a few examples. But this is the high level, the example that I see played out. And I did see that on submarines, and I see that with the companies that I've worked with as well. And for those of you who have joined, as you have questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. I'll try to stop periodically, and we'll reserve a good chunk of time at the end to have some live discussion as well. But I'll keep moving here. So before we get into the four specific examples, the way that I think about this more and more of that gear shift around the earlier stage CEO and the later stage leader, it really is an amplification problem where the culture cannot be directly absorbed from you. You can't get away with just doing great work. This now becomes about amplifying the message, the strategy, the culture, the priorities. And if you don't do that effectively, your culture quickly dilutes. You're unable to bring on and filter for the right individuals in the organization and set them up for success. You're unable to get a larger organization aligned around a very succinct list of priorities. So you're all pushing in the right direction. And I see it devolve more as guesswork where people don't really know your vision and your intention in a way where they can cleanly execute. And a lot of friction gets introduced and a lot of forward momentum gets lost. And the number one thing that I would say, both for that junior officer and department head on the submarine, as well as the CEO, is you cannot outwork this. This is not something you can white knuckle through. It's not a question of effort. It's a question more of amplification and deficiency, which we'll get into. And so the fix here, again, I will skip on the first one, delegation. I think there's many executive coaches that could effectively talk about delegating and how to do that. I imagine if you're in this room, you understand the importance of delegation and the skill set required there. But I will speak a little bit more to the other three because I think it's more directly relevant to my work and my experience. One of them, and we'll get into this with the first example, is looking at new communication tools. What has historically been done in person or in Zoom meetings now has to be an omni-channel approach and a very coordinated effort of communicating to external and internal stakeholders consistently the precise set of things that matter most in that moment. Repetition is another characteristic that I see, and I feel like the best leaders that I have worked with have mastered the art of saying the exact same thing a million different ways and even tailoring that to who they're speaking to. But they become really relentless. They become in many ways boring, and that they're just reiterating the same points over and over again. But they have started to realize that as the organization grows and as people's mental distractions get higher, they need to hear the same messages over and over again to actually have that penetrate through and persist on a cellular level within the organization. And then lastly, obviously, my company focuses on LinkedIn. I do think in this context, it is just one channel of many. So I can speak directly to LinkedIn, but I'm going to try to abstract this more because I do think that this is broadcasting through many channels, of which LinkedIn is valuable, but not the only app option and not the only one you should be doing. But again, this is all about how do you amplify that message. So to keep things moving here, I want to spend the bulk of our time today dissecting four different case studies. I have anonymized these today just because there are people that I have worked with or currently work with and don't want to disclose who those people are. They're real people. In the Q&A, we can get very precise on the specifics. But the flow that I'd like to take is walking through these four different examples. I'll tell you a little bit about the executive. I'll tell you what I learned from them and what I think you can learn from them as well. And then to make this a little bit more of a workshop, I'll walk through a few questions you can ask yourself or your team today to take action on this and start to internalize this. But at a high level, the four case studies that I extracted for us to review together. The first one, what I learned from this CEO is how he moved from communicating in one channel to taking much more of an omnipresent approach, realizing that his team learned in different locations and in different ways, and really 10xing the effort he put in to communicating to these critical stakeholders what they needed to know as the company evolved through their recent acquisition. So we'll go into that in detail. The second example that we're going to examine is a client of mine I really admire. I view this person as having made a transition from being likable to being polarizing. And this person, I think, is probably perceived as very controversial on social media. They have very strong stances, but we'll get into why that is and how that has become, I think, one of his company's biggest assets as it comes to filtering people into the organization, filtering investors and clients, and really making their life easier by being polarizing and rejecting people at the outset and attracting people as a lightning rod with these very strong values. The third that we'll get into is a client I've worked with where I've seen them transition as the organization has exponentially grown from really being selling to evangelizing. And I view that as one of those gear shifts. And I will get into the specifics of the distinction that I see there, but they have so effectively turned into a brand ambassador and evangelist. In a way, I used to work with this executive directly in a way where I have so much executive presence, branded swag now because he really inspired me to just always be wearing, ironically not today, the company swag and really being that evangelist. So we'll talk about that approach. And then the last one that we'll talk about is a client that I've worked with that made that shift from simply posting to really becoming the number one source of recruiting. And this is a 3,000 person organization. So it's no small claim seeing how they have used communication channels to really broadcast mission and values in a way that is attracting the right people into the organization. So the bulk of our time, we're going to double click on these in a little bit more of a storytelling mechanism. So the first example, and I'll set the stage. This is a healthcare software CEO. The company has about 850 employees. In the last 12 months, they were acquired by a Fortune 100 company. And what I learned from this executive very, very well was you cannot be in every room, obviously, when you're at that size. And he really intentionally and meticulously built a system to approximate him being in the room of an organization at that scale. And one of the insights that I learned from this person is that LinkedIn is just one speaker in a surround system of leadership. And he really showed me the playbook that we'll get into in the next slide of how he evaluated and created an ecosystem of communication, realizing that not every team member was in every location at every time. And while LinkedIn was important, it was just one speaker. So specifically, what he evolved while we were working together was, and again, this was just his approach, a system where every other week he would host town halls with his organization and be able to live communicate the updates and have his leaders do the same, be able to do Q&A right there. He also has an internal newsletter that he sends out, I believe, every 3 or 4 weeks, broadcasting that message via email to those key stakeholders. Like many of you, he has a Slack channel and he's used that in different ways to reinforce values, spotlight team members, communicate directly to the organization. Every 4 to 6 weeks, they do an AMA, an Ask Me Anything series, where through an anonymized system, people could ask him directly questions, and he will take those and answer those. I think that evolved into being a video that is recorded and sent out, but I think it started as a more live format. This person, because their team is broadly distributed, invests more and more time visiting the different offices and really having the face to face with those people. And then I would say, amidst the background of all of that, is the weekly metronome of their LinkedIn posts. But for my work with him, I saw through his lens how LinkedIn was much less of a priority for the external audiences and the customers or partners or investors that they might gain. And it was almost viewed as a internal stakeholder communication channel first. How do I lead at scale? How do I share my industry knowledge? How do I share my leadership philosophy? How do I show our values? How do I galvanize people around the direction that we're going? And so his LinkedIn posts have read more like internal memos, or that's clearly been his intention. But the impact was attracting the attention of this acquirer. So it did do more than just that. But I really admire how this leader clearly thought about all the different channels to communicate with, and then really mastering the art of reinforcement. Reinforcement was the goal, not reach. And he was very deliberate in the messages. He was very open to saying the same thing repeatedly, but in creatively new ways. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A. But I do want to kind of move to a little bit more of your own asking this for yourself. I do wonder for each of you here, let's just assume that you're active on LinkedIn. Beyond LinkedIn, how many channels do you communicate with your team on consistently, knowing that one and done does not work at that scale, that it has to be that surround sound rather than a single speaker? What would be the cost if you stopped showing up tomorrow? Would they still hear your priorities? If any one channel went away, would there still be ways that they're hearing that message from you? They're clearly getting those priorities from you. I think this third one is a big one. How closely does what you say externally on a podcast, on a stage, on social media, on LinkedIn, how much does that match what they are hearing internally? Is there a connection? Is there a disconnect? Would they view you as the same person across each of those? Or do they see some sort of gap in how you communicate externally, how you show up externally, and how you lead internally? Ideally, that alignment is there. And then the last question to kind of help you filter this for yourself, I would invite you to think of, when is the last time that you reinforced the same message in 3 different channels in one single week? That to me is the litmus test of this gear shift, that you have a system in place to communicate in multiple channels the same message, that you have the clarity of what message needs to be articulated, and that you're able to do it in different formats, in different channels, to make sure a larger organization hears it. One last thing before I move on. I do think one advantage with LinkedIn compared to other channels, I do think the data is very valuable, that as you share messages, you'll get objective feedback on which of those messages lands most. And that is one component of what might help you understand which messages to broadcast more repeatedly. It might help you figure out what stories, what values, what messages are salient and effective, and which ones fall flat. And then I'm a big fan of do more of what works. So once you've proven that the message works, then it's about how do you retell it and hit that same keynote from multiple angles. As you have questions, feel free to throw them in the Q&A pane, but I'm going to keep going, and we'll also have space for questions at the end. So the second example I want to talk about is polar opposites from the person I'm thinking of from the first example. I like to use this to illustrate the transition or the evolution from Likable to Polarizing. This person leads an education company. They're about 220 employees. They've raised about 35 million in funding. The critical one here, they have grown 162% in the last 2 years. So it is hard to fully encapsulate how quickly this organization has grown. And what I learned in working with this CEO is that when you hit that growth rate, you don't need more applicants, you need a better filter. And what I most admire about this CEO is how he has really embodied what their culture is, who their company is, and he unashamedly broadcasts that in a way that repels a lot of people. And I want to be clear here. I'm not saying that the goal here is to become polarizing. I do think that it's to not be lukewarm. And I see that for myself and many CEOs and leaders who are in that initial stage, they don't want to give people a reason to say no to them. They want to be accommodating and likable and trustable. They want to have wide appeal. What I saw in this gear shift of the CEO was the realization that if you're willing to be polarizing, it ultimately makes your life easier. So this is what I saw him doing. First of all, this company has a very strong culture. I would classify it, I don't know if he would classify it this way. I would classify it as hustle culture out loud. This person talks openly about the intensity of their work environment, the pace at which they're moving, the sacrifice he and his team are making, the non negotiable standards. And that absolutely repels people. There are people who dislike this person's posts. There are people who will never apply to this organization because of that. It might even repel potential customers and potential investors. But I will tell you, it is like sticking a lightning rod in the ground. And while it repels many, it attracts people who are hungry for that culture, who are wanting that pace, who want something besides just a 9 to 5. And I would argue not only are they attracting them, but it's repelling that wrong fit. It's saving the time and the cost of hiring the wrong people, attracting the wrong partners, attracting the wrong people. They're making it very clear what you get with when you interact with this organization. And they'd rather not waste the time working with the wrong people, hiring the wrong people, courting the wrong investor. One thing that I'll say is a side note here that I really admire. Not only, I think this is a triple gear shift, not only has this CEO effectively embodied this and effectively communicated it on many channels, of which LinkedIn is one, they have also successfully enrolled their key leaders in doing the same. And so this is no longer this sole wolf broadcasting this message. It really is a consistent message across the leadership team. And what I admire about that is that it demonstrates that this leader not only knows who they are and who they are not, but they have enrolled their leadership team in the same, and they now have a unified front communicating in multiple places what that culture is, what their mission is, who they are and who they are not. And while that may really trigger people, while that may invite a lot of criticism and dissent, which it does, it has been incredibly effective in helping them grow and scale very quickly. So lukewarm attracts lukewarm, clear values, clearly communicated, give people permission to self-select out before wasting everyone's time. As you have questions, feel free to throw them in the question pane, but I'm going to keep on moving here for the sake of time. The third, I'm sorry, the questions to ask here. Are you being clear enough to repel? I think of all the questions in this presentation, this first one's my favorite. When was the last time someone self-selected out because of something you said publicly? I bristle thinking about that, but I think if you can think of a time that that's occurred, you're probably on the right path. If you're still trying to speak to everyone and trying to be accepted by everyone, you're probably not niche down enough and not clear enough on those values and those messaging. Could a client read your link, or could a candidate read your LinkedIn and know whether they'd thrive at your company? Are these generic values and a generic work environment you're broadcasting? Or are you crystal clear on what works and what gets rewarded at your organization? And I think a sub question there is like, what do you believe about work and culture and work life that not everyone agrees with? Those are the edges to lean into. Those are the edges to court as you get more and more precise in who you want on board with where you're going. And then lastly, are your values specific enough to filter, or are they generic enough to fit anyone? Okay, third example of the four that we'll go through. This is a very different than the previous two. This CEO that I'm thinking of, I observed them and witnessed them and learned from them as they shifted from a salesperson to an evangelist. And this, for context, they run a consumer technology. So it is while most of the people I work with are a little bit more B2B, this is B2C. So take that caveat as we go through the specific mechanisms here. They're about 150 people. They've raised over 150 million. They've grown 38% in the last 2 years. And this person, they talk about their company incessantly. And I always think of this example because when I work with someone, I say, look, we're going to talk about your company 2 out of 10 posts on LinkedIn at most. And this person is like 8 or 9, but they get away with it for a very specific reason. And that's primarily because he's not selling, he's really evangelizing. And I do think that is the job at this stage. So let me talk a little bit more. First and foremost, he is always repping. This dude, I don't know if anything in his closet does not have his company's logo in it. Got the hat, the t-shirt, the everything. And he's always wearing it. And if you're open to taking photos with your phone, they work really well on LinkedIn and social media in general. But he often is taking these photos out in the wild, repping the brand. What that leads to is the other 2 points here: customer reactions and stories. So specifically, so much of his content is he's on a flight traveling somewhere, someone sees the merch and someone says, I know your company and I love it. And so he'll get a photo with that person, he'll relay that story. So it's not case studies, it's genuinely sharing the enthusiasm of the movement that he is building. He shares these stories very effectively. Again, it's not, this is what my company has done. It's not, this is why we're so great. It's definitely not, I'm so humbled to be in Forbes or Fortune magazine. It is much more of like, oh man, I met with this person on the plane and they shared this story and it deeply impacted me for these reasons. It's this build in public approach that I think works very effectively at this stage of really being the hype person in a very authentic way, but really championing that mission. And I think that this playbook works well if, hopefully everyone in this room, the company that you are leading, you really believe in the mission. And then it's less about promotion and it is more about being that ambassador, being that evangelist for this movement that you are leading. And I like this phrase here. I believe in this thing so deeply you can feel it. And I think that if I were to try to tease out one element I've seen them do effectively, I think that that's very, it works really well. I'm going to take a quick question here from Lindsay. Good to have you here, Lindsay. At some point, will you share more about your perspective on the shifting value of LinkedIn? There seems to be a growing sense of LinkedIn fatigue, driving people to Substack and elsewhere for more substantial discussion. Thoughts? Let's take a little interlude for this. This is actually, I have actually given a presentation on this several times in different places, and perhaps we'll do that as the next webinar. Let me say at a high level, I think there is a very real question that I would pose as, is LinkedIn going through growing pains, or is LinkedIn in the early or advanced stages of decline? And I can see an argument for each of these. I personally believe it is growing pains, and we'll talk about why. A couple things to note. I see there are a couple things driving the nearly universal frustration with LinkedIn. The three that I see is first and foremost, there is a lot of noise on LinkedIn. I attribute that to more people seeing the value of LinkedIn and showing up. And so there's a genuine growth there of people not just being on LinkedIn, but being vocal, which I actually think is a good thing. I think a second component of that is that ads are playing increased role on LinkedIn. And for those of you who have been around long enough, we have seen this play out before. I saw it play out in 2011 when Facebook introduced Facebook pages, and now companies could interact with individuals for the first time ever, really. And they had these Facebook pages. And one day it appeared that someone at Facebook flipped a switch from organic to paid, where it was seemingly overnight the exposure that brands used to get from posting and interacting and doing quizzes and polls on LinkedIn or on Facebook went away. And if they were not putting an ad buy behind their activity on Facebook, the decline exponentially decreased. And I make up the story that LinkedIn has done the same. I personally, when I'm scrolling the news feed, I notice and observe that many of the posts that are getting lots of traction, if you look closely, and it's a great feature of the ad, it's very subtle that it is a paid ad, but it will say promoted by executive presence or promoted by the organization. And that to me is the qualitative observation of like, oh, to get that same penetration and awareness, you do actually have to start throwing money at it, which I think is not necessarily a bad thing if you have the budget, and we can talk about that in the Q&A if you'd like. There are some significant advantages from a data and exposure standpoint in the way that LinkedIn ads are set up. And then I think that the final thing is that they just, I think the algorithm is on a transitional version. I personally feel like a lot of the content that I see is not relevant to me, and that does lead to a lot of fatigue. But I complement this by saying, and then I'll get back to the presentation, but it's a really good question, Lindsay. I complement this by saying that I just completed a 6-week program with LinkedIn. It was about 50 people. They called it the LinkedIn Executive Communicator Program. The people in the room with me were Fortune 50 people. I mean, it's like massive companies that are literally breaking acquisition news on LinkedIn. And they are, when they have their quarterly earnings calls for the public companies, LinkedIn is a part of that. And so as I see these larger organizations viewing this as a default thing that they do, I suspect that the staying power is there longer because there's significant money and interest coming from very big companies. And I think that will propel LinkedIn through these growing pains. Let me know as you have more questions, but I'll keep going on this. So as we think about this third example around evangelism, I think if you're asking this for yourself and of your team, are you telling stories or are you selling features? That smaller company leader, it is about selling. It is about the features. It is about the technical specifications. The larger organization understands that there on out, it is about storytelling. It's about shaping perception through targeted stories and targeted narratives. So I am curious, when was the last time you shared a story about your company that had nothing to do with your product or service? Or if someone followed you in any social channel for 30 days, would they feel something about your mission? Would they feel the passion that obviously led you to doing what you're doing? Are you the front man or the front woman for your company, or are you hiding behind the brand? And when was a moment this week you felt proud of your team and you actually did take the initiative to share that externally, starting to develop that muscle of broadcasting and amplifying what is going on in your organization? One last example, and then we'll pull this together and we'll switch to the Q&A. The fourth executive is actually the first non-CEO in the mix. This is a chief clinical officer. I view this story as what I've seen from posting to recruiting. This is the largest organization in the set that we're talking about today, about 3,000 employees. They're in healthcare, but they're also in a part of healthcare that has a massive talent shortage, where the number of people competing for the talent on the market exceeds the talent on the market. And so it's very competitive to attract the right people. Despite that, they've grown 26% over the last 2 years. And one of the amazing things from this story is that his recruiting team told him, like, your LinkedIn posts are the number one source of our recruiting. People in the interview process would reference it. They would reference the values. They would reference the mission. They would reference is that how they got aware of the organization. So it is not just a it's not just a tactic. This is fundamentally shaping the organization. So what I would love for you to know about this, and what I think this person does very effectively, is first of all, it is all mission driven. This person was drawn to this industry and to this company because they deeply, in a bone marrow way, believe in the mission. Like they would probably do this job if they were not paid. And that comes through in anything that you see from this person, whether it is at a conference, which he speaks at frequently, or LinkedIn or other channels. You almost have to turn down the brightness on the screen because it's like, oh man, this person really believes this mission, and it's very effective. I think this person, and it's authentic to who they are, they are very adept at spotlighting their team. They very much spread the love. And this is, I think, one of the characteristics of these leaders, and probably true of at least two of the four that we're talking about today. They are much more inclined to spotlight their team than themselves. They're showing the type of leader they are in doing so. But when they experience someone on their team embodying their culture or embodying a characteristic that they want to see replicated, it's not just an attaboy. It is let me broadcast this. Let me give the love. Let me show the example. Let me show, not tell. And I think it's been very effective in this. This person, and this is probably one area that they spike compared to the other four that we're talking about. Deeply reflective human being and very vulnerable. Most of the posts about this person's team are positive and are very praiseworthy. Most of the posts about themselves are very vulnerable and a very honest self-assessment of where they have fallen short, where they have failed, where they struggle, where they are trying to grow as a leader. It works extremely effectively because the people that work for this person, the people who interact with them, it is what you see is what you get. They are very clear on how they are growing as an individual, how they are falling short. But I see that gives permission for his team to fail as well. And it also puts pressure for them to be on their own growth journey, to be upping their game. And the last one is they're very effective, and this doesn't work for every organization, but very transparent on the culture, team events, the day-to-day, behind the scenes, something that happened last week in a meeting, something that happened 2 weeks ago in a one-on-one. They're doing that build in public, the show don't tell, and it's very effective. I think that, one note that I'll say before we move on here, vulnerability does signal psychological safety in a way no careers page ever could. Your future top hires are forming opinions about you right now. And I would argue that as you think of the stereo system that you're building to broadcast out about your organization, one of the soundtracks to play is vulnerability. If you're willing to share about setbacks for the organization, setbacks for yourself, if you're willing to be honest, I think that really pierces through the noise. In general, specifically for LinkedIn, as AI kind of floods the market, I think that I tend to see more generic statements that read like Nike slogans. But I think that one way to differentiate is the equivalent of I like to say the flex and the vulnerability. I accomplished something great, and here's a mistake I made. And if you're willing to talk about those mistakes, I think it really brings people closer, especially on LinkedIn, but in general. And this leader has done that very, very effectively. So last, apply it as you think about recruiting. Would your best future hire want to work for you based on your LinkedIn? If a candidate looked at your top 10 posts, last posts, what would they learn and observe about who you are as a leader? Are you spotlighting your team publicly, or are you using that to reinforce what sets you apart? Are you showing the reality of what it's like to work at your organization, or does it seem like every other place? And what would change if you started to have the longer lens? If you were thinking of who you're going to hire 2 years from now, what are you communicating today to get on their radar and to start to formulate that perception that will ultimately attract them to your organization years from now? So, two more things, and then we'll open up to Q&A. I really, if you take nothing else away from this, my intention was to spotlight 4 fairly different examples of leaders who are making that gear shift and doing it in public. But I really want you to realize that the name of the game here is authenticity. I am not encouraging you to be anyone different than the leader that you are today. I am encouraging you to lean in the areas of discomfort, to lean into the edges that feel like a stretch to you. But at the heart of all of this, all 4 of these executives, it is not an act. This is who they are. It is just amplifying who they are. And what I like to think of, and the people that I work with, is if you're on this webinar today, if you're leading an organization, I would bet all of my Star Wars action figures that there is something about you that intrinsically attracts investors, employees, clients, opportunities. There is something about you that is magnetic. And whoever you work with, if you work with your internal marketing team, a comms channel, someone like us, the goal, in my view, is to present you in as high fidelity as possible to the public eye, to do it in a way that is strategic, where you are highlighting the elements that are most important to where you are in a growth curve, and then to really paying attention to what lands so you can do more of it. Because ultimately, you're going to need a system of repetition and variety and omnichannel approach to do this at scale, to shape perception, to achieve whatever it is you're heading towards. The four examples, though, just to remind you, there is that systems builder who views LinkedIn as one speaker in the stereo system of what he is doing to engage with his team. There's that second one, the intense one, who's using a very strong and polarizing view to repel and to attract effectively. You've got that storyteller, that brand evangelist who is really repping, who is really always evangelizing, not selling. And then you've got this vulnerable leader who is really on a mission and sharing that and bringing people along. The playbook might change, but the message comes down to who you are. So I do want to do two things. I think just in the spirit of time, I'm going to kill the screen share here. I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to put in the chat pane the survey. I would genuinely love to know, or actually I can do a poll or quiz. Here we go. I would love to get your feedback on how we did well today, where to improve, and what to do next time. But I'll use the remainder for the Q&A. So Janet, good to have you here. Looking forward to connecting with you soon. You said focus on your statement that you generally recommend 2 out of 10 posts be about company. How do executives best balance personal leadership versus company executive messaging? What are the 8 other posts focused on to keep a personal identity? Love this question, Janet. So in my organization, we view this as the content strategy. And I would say that the generic starting point that I would want to tailor to an individual is 4 things. And the 4 buckets that I think universally work for a leader, I'll cover them at a high level and we'll double click on them. The first is industry thought leadership. The second is leadership and career journey. The third is company promotion. And the fourth is work adjacent. The first 2, I think, usually as a starting point, get the biggest slice of the pie. Industry thought leadership, the shorthand for that is, if you had your target audience in a room and you had an hour to give a keynote, but you could not mention your organization, what do you talk about? And the key here, as you think about this, Janet, is to envision the pie chart. What can you speak to with authority? There's a lot of things there. Where are you a subject matter expert? Lots of things in that circle. The second circle is, what does your target audience care about? What keeps them up at night? And as much as possible, you want to live at that intersection of that Venn diagram, which takes both generosity in sharing, but also a tremendous amount of empathy, of understanding where, from your unique background, you can educate and help people and whatever keeps them up at night. So that's industry thought leadership. The second one that works effectively for many leaders is what we call leadership and career journey. And what I mean by that is, you have likely done other things besides what you're currently doing right now. I want to know about it. I want to know about the formulative events, more in a professional sense, college instructor that had an impact on how you show up today, job that you didn't get, or job that you did get, or boss, or I just want to know all of the chapters of your life that led into who you are as a leader today. What that does effectively is it gives you credibility, but it usually does it through a story. And I feel like stories in any context, it's the bacon that you wrap around anything that makes it more appealing. It just really allows your point to land. And so often in these leadership and career journeys, sometimes it's leadership moments from your current organization. Oftentimes it's more of the history of formulative events and people and milestones that shape who you are now. And those are generally at a starting point, the 2 biggest buckets. The third is company promotion. We can double click on this if you'd like. I would love in any setting, LinkedIn or any setting, I would love for you to talk about your organization rather than just sharing press clippings. This tends to be the origin story or major milestones of your organization, spotlighting employees, sharing values, sharing events, but it's all story driven. That tends to make it more effective. And then the last and the smallest bucket I would call work adjacent. The test that I do for this is the dinner party test. So if Janet was seated around her ideal audience, over dinner, what is fair game to talk about that? And that's usually a pretty effective filter to know between religion, politics, family, sports, like what is okay to talk about. And it's a very personal question. There's no universal answer. But if you would talk about a certain topic in that intimate dinner setting, I think it's fair game to talk externally. If not, don't do it. And so personally, I'm not going to talk about religion or politics, or I'm not going to talk about a lot of things. I will talk about meditation or running or men's group work. I'll talk about certain hobbies and things like that. And that's my work adjacent, but it'll be different for you. Um, so let's see. I answered. I'm not as familiar with the interface here. What other questions do you have? We have a few more minutes here. Would greatly appreciate your feedback in the webinar feedback form. What other questions do you have that I could answer before we wrap? While I wait for that, I do love talking about this. You should have my email address from the invite, easy to find on LinkedIn. If you'd like to talk about this individually, let me know. I'm happy to meet with you one-on-one to answer your questions, to talk about this more. And I will keep you informed as we do more webinars in the future based on the feedback we get from the participants today. We're actively thinking about the next webinar topic. I want to make sure this is value additive, that we're doing it in a way that is answering your most pertinent questions and doing so in a way that's trustable and informative and ideally data driven. So please let me know your responses to those interview questions. And I'll wait one more minute. If there's any straggling questions, in the bottom, there's a Q&A tab, and you can submit a question there, and I will answer that if there's any other questions left.